preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Good evening. My name is Laura Peskin, and I'm Director of Languages and Humanities here at the 92nd Street Y. I'd like to welcome you to tonight's event, Why Hannah Arendt Matters, with Elisabeth Young-Bruehl. To mark the centenary of Hannah Arendt's birth, Elisabeth Young-Bruehl discusses her new book, Why Arendt Matters, which revisits Arendt's major works and seminal ideas and explores the particular relevance of the great philosopher's thought to the world of today. Elisabeth Young-Bruehl received her PhD in philosophy under Arendt's supervision at the graduate faculty of the New School for Social Research. She is a faculty member at the Columbia Center for Psychoanalytic Training and Research and a practicing psychoanalyst. She is also the author of the definitive biography of Arendt entitled Hannah Arendt for Love of the World. Please join me in welcoming Elisabeth Young-Bruehl. Thank you.
Thank you, and I appreciate very much your inviting me to the Y. It's always fun to come to the Y. I don't usually talk at the Y. I usually come and listen at the Y, but always to very interesting people. The centenary of Hannah Arendt's birth has been a very interesting year for me as her biographer, because I've been all over the world to conferences. And I have this strange feeling that I'm being hauled out as a kind of representative of like the last living person who knew Hannah Arendt and who was her student, and the only person, in fact, who ever received a PhD in philosophy under her supervision. So I have this kind of I don't know, atmosphere that precedes me to conferences at all kinds of places, and young people come up to me and say, well, what was she really like? Or what was it really like to study with her? And I feel I have to present the last living autobiography about her. I share this task with my oldest friend from graduate school, who's a man named Jerome Cohen, who's the editor of Hannah Arendt's posthumous works and her literary executor, and who has in the last 6 or 7 years produced 4 volumes of Hannah Arendt's uncollected, sometimes unpublished, sometimes untranslated into English papers, including one which I want to mention in this context, may be of particular interest to you, a large volume that has just come out this winter called The Jewish Writings. And this is Hannah Arendt's writings about Jewish affairs, Jewish history, Jewish questions from the period of the 1930s up until the year of her death, 1975. So for those of you who need so that I don't know what your acquaintance with Hannah Arendt is, let me frame what I'm going to say about her work with just a mini biography to connect you to her. She was born 100 years in 1906 in Königsberg, which is now called Kaliningrad and is part of Russia. It has had quite a story too, Königsberg. But it's a very famous philosopher's town because Immanuel Kant lived and worked there, spent his entire life there, never left, and observed the world from that particular perch, reading his newspapers about the French Revolution and writing books which were of enormous significance to Hannah Arendt's teachers. And Hannah Arendt's teachers were particularly 2. She, like all German university students of her vintage, went to many German universities. When you went to university in Germany in the 1920s, you made an odyssey from here to there, to there, to there, to there, then attached yourself to a particular person at each place, not to a university. This is still a kind of apprentice and mentoring system of education. And she studied when she was still quite a young woman in 20 with Martin Heidegger, who was probably the most, as she once put it, secretly famous philosopher in Germany at the time. His reputation had gone out amongst the young, and they came to him to study because it was rumored that he had something really novel and interesting to say. And I'll tell you a little bit more about what that was later. But she studied with him, and also, so it was told in my biography, which was first published in 1982, told for the first time to the world, had a love affair with Martin Heidegger, her teacher. And this love affair has, as it were, stalked Hannah Arendt's reputation ever since it became known, for the obvious reason that Martin Heidegger had both a very great fame as a philosopher, but a great infamy as having enrolled himself in the Nazi Party for a year, and been the rector of Freiburg University when the edict which forbade Jews to study or to teach in German universities was promulgated, and Heidegger was in the incredible position, for example, of refusing his own teacher access to universities. And Heidegger was, after the war, under the denazification policies of post-war Germany, banned from teaching for a time. So he had quite a troubled reputation. And it astonished many people to learn that Hannah Arendt had had a youthful affair with him. I'll speak more about it later. But the other person that she studied with on her odyssey of German universities was a man named Karl Jaspers, who was really the opposite in terms of reputation, a man of absolute integrity, who had stood very firm in his position at Heidelberg University in opposition to the Nazis as they rose to power and as they took over the universities. He himself was not Jewish, so he was not banned from teaching. He was able to keep his position at Heidelberg through the war, but he was married to a Jewish woman. This is very unusual at the time for a North German Protestant man to be married to a Jewish woman. So she was always, her life was in jeopardy. And at the end of the war, both of them were on a list that the Nazis had drawn up for shipment to Auschwitz. And only the end of the war and the American liberation of Heidelberg saved them from that fate. Karl Jaspers, who's unfortunately not very well known in this country, despite the fact that Hannah Arendt put a great deal of effort into having his work translated and published in this country. He's much better known in Europe, and particularly known not for his strictly philosophical writings, but for his political interventions, which were extraordinary. He wrote a book in 1931 called The Situation of Man in the Modern Age, which was a critique of the entire atmosphere in Germany that helped bring the Nazis to power. A book which it's really quite remarkable that he didn't lose his life for this book. And it was almost unique in Germany at that period as a critique of the Weimar Republic and its susceptibility to being overtaken by this Nazi phenomenon. That was an extraordinary act of courage. And then after the war, he was the first major intellectual figure to publish a book calling attention to the existence in our world of nuclear weapons and the danger that that represented. It was called The Atom Bomb and the Future of Mankind. And it provoked an enormous discussion in Europe and is the seminal book behind the nuclear disarmament movement in Europe. And then later in his life, in the late 1960s, he made yet another foray into the public domain and wrote a book that was published in English under the title The Future of Germany, which was a critique of the German Republic of the late 1960s as drifting toward dictatorship, as he put it. And it was the book that galvanized the German student movement against the Bundesrepublik. So Karl Jaspers was absolutely a model of the philosopher who paid attention to the world and wrote politically. Martin Heidegger was a perfect model of the person who paid no attention to the world and drifted off into his own thinking realm and was naive beyond belief about the Nazi phenomenon and what it represented, and even entertained the kind of delusion that he would be a philosopher for the National Socialist movement, which of course had zero interest in him, and probably not a soul in the National Socialist movement would have been able to read one of Martin Heidegger's books, much less use it for any political purpose. But he is a perfect example of the kind of intellectual that Hannah Arendt wasn't. And Jaspers is a very good example of the kind of intellectual that she was. She herself had to flee Germany in 1933 when the Nazis came to power because she'd been working for the Zionist movement in Berlin, collecting anti-Semitic material for counter-propaganda to the Nazi regime. And all the people who were involved in that activity were to be rounded up by the Gestapo, and so she was able to escape after a brief arrest, and ended up in Paris, where there was a huge émigré German community, and that did all kinds of work against the Nazi regime, insofar as it was possible to do so in France. Hannah Arendt herself worked for an organization that still exists in a present form called Jugendallee, the Youth Aliyah, and this prepared young Jews from all over Europe, many of whom had been separated from their parents or had even lost their parents, to emigrate to Palestine. And she did a lot of preparatory work for that, educational work, and at one point made a trip with a group of young people to Palestine, her first visit to the Jewish homeland. But she was able, unlike, of course, many others, to get eventually the proper permis and visas to come to America, which she did in the company of a man that she'd met in Paris and married, whose name was Heinrich Blücher, not a Jew, but a Berlin-born, self-educated, not a university man at all, but a member of the Spartacus Bund, which was the far-left socialist group headed up by Rosa Luxemburg in Germany. He was a political man, and this was a novelty for her, and a self-taught intellectual, also a novelty, without one of those incredible German educations which were at that time so formidable. And a man whose passion was for reading military history, and he was a very, very interesting and dynamic man who, when he came to this country, immediately got a job as shoveling chemicals in a chemical factory. She managed to get a job doing little journalistic things while she learned English, which she did very rapidly, and was able, even only 10 years of being here, to write a formidable book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, in English, having come to this country speaking not a one word of it, though she knew Greek, Latin, French, but at any rate, re-educated herself. And they lived in New York, on the other side of the park. And what was in the Jewish side of the park, but morning for a time on Riverside Drive, Morningside Heights, apartments around in that area. And she wrote for the German Jewish newspaper, which still exists, though it's in a magazine form now, called Aufbau. And during the war, wrote a whole series of articles advocating for a Jewish army. And this was a very courageous position to take at the time. Not very many people took it, though there were many, many people in other parts of the world who did. And the result of that advocacy campaign was that there was a Jewish brigade of the British Army in which many people that she knew enrolled, including another of my teachers at the New School, her oldest friend from university days, a man named Hans Jonas. She wrote those articles about the Jewish army, and then she wrote a series of articles about Palestine and the situation of the Jewish emigration to Palestine and the complexity of two peoples, the immigrant one, of course there were established Jewish settlements, but the immigrant one of Jews tossed out of Europe and up on the shores of Palestine, and the indigenous, at that time, Arab population, and what should become of that situation. And she was one of the strongest arguers for the possibility of a binational state in Palestine. And she joined in that crusade with a man named Judah Magnus, whose name may be known to some of you, who was a Hebrew University professor, a very great friend of Martin Buber, who also advocated for a binational state at the time. And they put together a small crusade, as it were, in this country to make that case, of course, unsuccessfully. But all of these early pieces of Hannah Arendt's are available now in that volume that I mentioned to you before, called The Jewish Writings. And I think that it will go a long way to kind of alter people's sense of her and her relationship to the Jewish people, her people, which is a very vexed matter. Hannah Arendt made basically three huge contributions to American and world philosophy and politics. The first one came in a book called The Origins of Totalitarianism. It was first published in 1951 and contained the first taxonomy of totalitarianism as a novel form of government. No one had identified the Nazi regime as a novel form of government. There was a whole tradition in political theory of descriptions of types of governments that goes back to the Greeks and through Montesquieu. Democracy, oligarchy, timocracy, all the ocracies. But nobody had identified that the Nazi regime really represented a form of government that had never existed before on the earth. She made this identification, and then as she worked on the book, she noticed, as materials after the war became available, that many of the structures of government in the Soviet Union were the same. Not the history of these regimes was very different. The ways they came to power were very different. The ideologies that governed them were very different. But as forms of government, they were very similar. So The Origins of Totalitarianism sets out that taxonomy of a novel form of government in two variant forms. This contribution that appeared in 1951 was immediately hailed, for example, by Dwight MacDonald, who was one of the great critics of the time, as a book, as he said, comparable to Marx. It was her first book, an astonishing thing. She was 45 years old, but this was just like she burst upon the scene in this country as a major intellectual figure, somebody who came really from nowhere. She had no university appointment, no network, no nothing, just this book. And it has stood there as a monument ever since it was published 50 years ago, a model of political analysis, but also, I would say it's no exaggeration to remark that it is the most important and influential work of political theory of the mid-century. The whole trajectory of our world's political life since then has referenced itself to the mid-century and to the existence of the Nazi regime and the Soviet regime. There is not an event that happens that isn't what in my current trade of psychoanalysis is called a reactivation of a trauma. So that every time in this world that we live in that you want to designate somebody your enemy, you say that they have created a totalitarian regime. As we speak, we're in the process of voices from Washington creating Iran as a totalitarian regime, which it most decidedly is not. And before, we had Iraq created as a totalitarian regime, which it most decidedly was not. But this is the way that politics, international affairs, has been set up ever since the mid-century, that you demonize with this word totalitarian. That makes it very hard to identify something that actually is totalitarian. There's a kind of a cry wolf phenomenon. And how would you know a real totalitarian regime if you saw one? Because so many have been called this. And fortunately or unfortunately, depending on how you look at it, in Hannah Arendt's terms. Though, of course, as things go, the actual analysis in this 800-page book is known to very few people. But it is invoked all of the time. So it shares with Marx's work that kind of invocability because it is really a monumental vision. This major contribution to the understanding of politics in the mid-century is of such crucial significance for today if people would only but read the book as opposed to hear the labeling and the kind of mudslinging that the book is used for. Not because we live in an era of totalitarianisms. We don't. But because we live in an era in which states and their existences are profoundly influenced by the aftershocks and the after effects of totalitarianism. One of the things that is most important, I think, to understand about the world in which we live is that the techniques of totalitarian government not only had profound impact for the people who lived within those regimes in Germany and Greater Germany, as Hitler liked to call it, and in the Soviet Union, but in all of the states that allied themselves to fight these regimes. Because one of the most significant things about our world is that the people who fought totalitarian governments and their techniques learned from that they fought. For example, Hannah Arendt was the first to point out that in a totalitarian regime, it's the secret service or what we would call the intelligence community, and its techniques, which are central to the control that the totalitarian regime exercises over all its people. Many of you may have seen the recent brilliant movie called Lives of Others, in which this is so apparent that the military is not anywhere to be seen, of course, in that film. It's the Secret Service which is able to make the kind of total control over people's lives and terrorization of them happen. All of the techniques of the secret services of those regimes, of the Nazi and the Soviet regime, were very well learned by the people who had to fight them and have become part and parcel of the security apparatuses of every state in the world now. This kind of what is now known as blowback effect of becoming involved in something and then having it take you over is one of the most important things, I think, to understand about the way politics is done now in the world. We don't have totalitarian regimes. What we have is omnipresent totalitarian techniques used by everybody for purposes good and bad. But to read the descriptions of these totalitarian techniques in Arendt's book is enormously illuminating if you then look out on the world. For example, this about the Secret Service is one example. For another example, she claimed that the essence of the form of government totalitarianism is terror, that the whole regime is organized to terrorize, and that the central technique of that is torture. And it begins with small acts of torture, which then become larger acts of torture, which then become larger acts of torture, which become institutions of torture, and then become centralized institutions of torture, which is the phrase that she used to describe the concentration camp. There's a continuum of types of torture that a totalitarian regime uses, and it just grows slowly from the mild, as it were, end of the torture continuum to the totally concentrated torture of a concentration camp. In the Soviet context, it would be a labor camp rather than a concentration camp. She understood that a totalitarian regime's ideology, its vision of how things naturally are and how they will be in the future, its historical vision, necessitates for its believability these institutions of torture. In other words, what you do with anybody who does not subscribe to your ideology is torture them. You make it very apparent that if you do not subscribe to the ideology, if you don't sign on for the ideology, you will be persecuted, tortured, shipped off, and up the scale it goes. So the first thing that a totalitarian regime does is to try to create a kind of a lock think in which people will not criticize the regime, and they will not criticize the regime's ideology. This happens every time a regime, not even necessarily a totalitarian regime, wants to inflict itself on either its own populations or others. The same kind of techniques are used. First, to create a kind of lock think where it becomes dangerous to dissent. And people self-censor themselves so that the regime doesn't even really have to do overt censorship. That is what, in a nutshell, has happened to the media in this country. And not just recently, since the 1950s, when the media has subscribed, it hasn't even been told to subscribe by the government, it has done this all on its own, has subscribed to the imperialist visions of this country, just as the Soviet media subscribed to the imperialist visions of the Soviet Union during the Cold War, both opposing camps and very similar kinds of techniques. The Soviets, because they were still de-totalitarianizing from a whole generation being completely shaped and molded by a totalitarian regime. Ours, because a whole generation had been shaped and molded by fighting a totalitarian regime and coming up with the ideology that ours was the good guys, and that anything that we did, because it was anti-totalitarian, was therefore by definition a good thing, and that we had the right, as it were, or even the duty to impose upon people all over the world our anti-totalitarian ideology. And Hannah Arendt wrote about this in the 1950s and 1960s when it could not have been a more unpopular thing to do. Because the kind of the riding high self-righteousness of this country, victorious in the war that was the justified war, was not ready to hear that one of the saddest things, in her estimation, that had happened to this country was that it had really sold out a good deal of its commitment to freedom to the techniques that it had used to fight for freedom. So she would constantly point out that what our country was doing in the 1950s, for example, in Latin and South America, was no different than the creeping totalitarianism of the so-called Thousand-Year Reich. That the creation of what then were called in the 1950s and into the 1960s national security states in Latin and South America were the creation of little totalitarian entities to reach out for, and that there was no difference between this and what the Soviet Union had done in Eastern Europe. She did not, come forth. I've just given you the bald version of that, the the unadorned version of that for simplicity's sake. She wrote it very intricately and in a series of political essays that were not designed explicitly to make that point that I just made. They were designed to analyze in intricate detail, this is the work of the 1960s and early 1970s that Arendt did, in intricate detail, all of the basic concepts that we use and need for our political life. Concepts like authority, freedom, democracy, culture. To analyze these kinds of concepts in great historical detail and show you in these philosophical political essays what a society that was not distorted by either being totalitarian or fighting totalitarian, what a society not thus distorted, how it would understand these concepts. In other words, she didn't just sign on, as you're asked to do now almost every day, to democracy is the best form of government. Not even with a joke, a Churchillian joke about except for all the others, but that to sign on to democracy, she would make very careful distinctions between democracy, which after all in the ancient Greek word means rule by the demos, that's the people, and it's thought to be the worst form of government if you read Aristotle, because it's structureless, it doesn't have any purpose to it, it's completely susceptible to the fluctuations and fads of the day, to use very un-Greek terminology. She'd never advocated democracy. What she advocated, after doing intricate analyses of what the meanings of the terms, was republicanism. And I do not mean with a capital R, but with a little r, that she was very interested in the form of government which, at least since Montesquieu, has been called the republic. In Latin, the res publica. And what this meant was not direct rule by the mob, as it were, or by any majority that could be assembled to move things one way. You can see how dangerous that kind of thing is when you look at local communities in our country where you elect a school board and suddenly you're teaching creationism in the schools, just boom, like that. That a kind of mob think can have enormous power when there are not structures that prevent. A republic is one, and she wrote a whole book about this called On Revolution. A republic is one that is organized around what we know, thanks to our founding fathers, as checks and balances. That it has a parliamentary form to it, it has a judiciary form to it, it has an executive form to it, and none of these can take power over others. That the system is set up so that none can prevail, and this means that even the Congress or the Congress and Senate that are elected by the people cannot, because the judiciary will check them, impose their will immediately upon others. There has to always be a process of vetting, as it were, the legislation that takes place. She admired this form of government, and she was, I think, probably one of the most avid readers of the Federalist Papers in the history of our country, astonished by the vision and prescience of the founding fathers. And this book, the On Revolution, in which she sets out these conceptual analyses and then political analyses, also contains a theory of enormous that has had enormous play and has been enormously important in not just in academic, political, theoretical circles, but amongst politicians. When it trickles out, some politicians read books. And in the 1960s, a lot of politicians read this book on revolution, which really was something like the handbook of the American student movement. In my day, when I went to be a graduate student with Hannah Arendt, which I started being in the vintage year 1968, everyone read On Revolution. I remember having a conversation with Tom Hayden, who at that time was the part of the Students for Democratic Society, and saying to him, were you brought up on Revolution? He said, well, weren't we all? Isn't that what the Port Huron Statement is all about? It's about the importance of participatory local democracy as the founding level of Republican governance. This book had tremendous influence, and the theory that's at the center of it, that there have in the modern world, since the 18th century, been basically two forms of revolution: the French and the American. And that the French Revolution, driven by concern for social justice and for inequality and the rectification of inequalities, and basically driven by an economic vision, a vision of a reinstituted overthrow of the aristocracy and a reinstituted economic life that would rescue the impoverished masses of Europe from their impoverishment. That model of the French Revolution, which of course had a very unhappy fate to it, as the revolution, so the phrase went, devoured its own children, and turned out to be the perfect form of revolution to produce a counter-revolution. That has been the model revolution in the modern world, she argued, with disastrous results. Whereas the other form of revolution, which she thought had been really quite unique in the history of the modern world, that is, ours, had not been anybody's model. And that this revolution, the American Revolution, had as its central goal not the reconstitution of economic life, because this revolution took place in a country where there was not abject poverty or lack of resources, so that the revolution was not intended to bring about redistribution of the wealth. It was intended to overthrow a tyrannical regime, or to win independence from a regime that had come to be viewed as tyrannizing. So its goal was political, not economic. And the thing aimed for in our revolution was a constitution. That was the most valued thing. And it is clear that the Founding Fathers considered their mission to be the writing of the Constitution, not any policy that would follow from it. But it was a revolution to make politics possible in a new way and protect the political space from encroachment, either from external encroachment or from internal encroachment, like from the masses. Our Founding Fathers were very worried about the masses. They were very worried about majority opinion and what could happen if the majority prevailed, so they have all kinds of protections against that. This failure, as it were, of the American Revolution, and a revolution for the purposes of making a viable polity, not having the kind of play in the modern world, was, Hannah Arendt thought, the key disaster of the modern world. She had studied many disasters in the origins of totalitarianism, but this one she thought was central. She saw it lying behind European imperialisms of the 19th century, the rampant expansion across the globe of capitalism, because there was no check upon this by states, and in fact, states signed on to the project of creating world enterprises. They would sign, the French would sign on to the project of creating the Panama Canal. She was, in effect, with this kind of critique, writing the first critique of globalization. Long before that word ever came into our vocabularies, and long before it came into our vocabularies along with a phenomenon that didn't exist when Hannah Arendt died in 1975. She couldn't see it developing, but her whole analysis is prescient in this way, the existence of the transnational corporation as the latest development of capitalism, a transnational corporations which are without state regulation. That is, they are not within states, so they're not regulated by states, and there exists very little in the way of international framework to regulate them. This is like 19th century capitalism moved across the globe and in bigger and more powerful, less regulated forms. She didn't see that phenomenon at the end of it, but the whole description of, on revolution and in the imperialism section of the Origins of Totalitarianism spells this out without the details of the way it evolved in the 1980s and 1990s. That's what Hannah Arendt was doing in the work in the middle phase of her career. If the Origins of Totalitarianism is the first phase, and then this is the middle phase of her career. Late in her life, she did something really very extraordinary, in many ways extraordinary. She, this is such an unusual thing for an intellectual to do. Intellectuals being almost always driven by a certain kind of infatuation with their own thought and their own ideas and an inability to revise and rethink. But she took the opportunity of the trial in Jerusalem in 1961 of Adolf Eichmann to go as a reporter for The New Yorker, arranged by Wally Shawn, then the great editor of The New Yorker, this venue, to see Adolf Eichmann's, to visit Adolf and report on Adolf Eichmann's trial in Jerusalem. And she did this, as she says in her letters to other people, because she wanted to see one of these people in the flesh, one of these people about whom she had written so enormously. And she build this journey of hers to Jerusalem as what she called a cura posteriore. Hannah Arendt was one of the last people. This is why you're talking to the last student of the last one, whose descriptions of what they were doing came in Latin. A posterior, an after-the-fact cure for what totalitarianism had meant to her and for the writing of the book about this, which had kept her, as it were, so very close to the study of horrors. Could there be a new perspective on this? Eichmann shocked her when she encountered him in his glass booth in Jerusalem. If any of you are interested in this, there exists a film made by an Israeli and a French collaboration team called The Specialist, which actually is made up of the documentary footage of Eichmann's trial, which was discovered only a few years ago in an archive in Israel, and a film was made out of it so that you can see this trial, as Hannah Arendt herself saw it in the courtroom. This man, Eichmann, shocked her because he was not like some of the defendants at the Nuremberg trials, a thumping, arrogant, demonical type who had not given up his convictions about the regime and its importance at all. This man was a bureaucrat. He's right out of the lives of others. He fascinated by bureaucratic arrangements, fascinated by technical arrangements, fascinated by the possibility of getting trains to run from here to there to there, fascinated with himself and the possibility that he might rise in the Nazi hierarchy because he was gifted for a particular kind of transportation arrangements. And people found him very effective at this, and he rose in the hierarchy, and he was very interested in that. He had, as he said at his trial, no interest whatsoever in the Jewish question. That he made variations on the theme of "some of my best friends are Jews" kind of remarks. He told about how the first time that he had visited killing centers in Poland and that he had been utterly repelled and had felt sick and couldn't go back and never wanted to think about this again, and never did. He described all this in bureaucratic German. Hannah Arendt called Naziese, that was almost a language in and of itself, that belonged to a world in and of itself, that was really quite removed from the impact of what he did or what his actions meant to actual people. She described him as banal. And by this, she really didn't mean superficial, though he certainly was, or even callous, though he certainly was. What she really meant was thoughtless. And she meant something very particular by that. She meant he seems never to have had an internal conversation with himself about what he was doing. He never seemed to have asked himself the question, what is the consequence of my actions going to be for any real people? She subtitled her report on the trial of Eichmann in Jerusalem as a report on the banality of evil. And then upon her head fell the most extraordinary controversy of the late 20th century. A controversy that was in the 1960s when it took off. It involved press all over the world. It involved, you cannot imagine, I mean, I could not imagine when I was her biographer, the shelf of books that contain all of the controversy, as it was known in Europe, without even about what. It was just the controversy. And it still is, die Kontroverse in Germany. You don't even have to name it. And it goes on and on and on and on. It constitutes one of the reasons why I'm so happy to be here at a Jewish organization discussing Hannah Arendt and her significance, because Hannah Arendt was, in her lifetime, persona non grata in the Jewish community. She would never have been invited to this place or any other to discuss this work, because it was assumed in this book that Hannah Arendt had exculpated Adolf Eichmann from responsibility for his crimes by calling him a thoughtless person. Or even, so some people said, we're all Eichmanns. All bureaucrats are like this. And so it's like, as Hegel used to say, in this night all the cows are dark. That she had no specificity of responsibility for him. And that that was bad enough, because at the time, in the 1960s, when she wrote this book, it was a taken for granted idea that the Nazis were demonic, that they were monstrous, that they were bent on evil, that they did evil intentionally, that they were, as she herself had said in the Origins of Totalitarianism, radically evil because they intended to do evil. And she was here making the claim that all Adolf Eichmann intended to do was rise in the Nazi hierarchy. And this was just an appalling thought at the time, and in many circles it still is. But that wasn't the worst thing that Hannah Arendt did in this book. As you can see if you watch the movie The Specialist, there's a huge part of the trial of Adolf Eichmann that was dedicated to the role in the Holocaust. It was then beginning to be called the Holocaust. That word for the destruction of European Jewry came into currency in the course of the Eichmann trial and the controversy that surrounded it. Before then, it was simply called the destruction of European Jewry. Now we call it the Holocaust, and then we have to call it the Shoah, as things have changed over time, as the perception of these events has changed over time. A great deal of the trial was dedicated to witnesses who came forth to talk about the role of the so-called Jewish councils in the Holocaust. These were local or Jewish organizations, existing Jewish organizations that existed before the war, that were co-opted by the Nazis in a very subtle and Sophie's Choice kind of way. Like, either you cooperate with us and we will try to save some of your people, or you don't cooperate with us and we'll kill you all, kind of situations, co-opted into becoming registrants of Jewish citizens of communities and providers of lists for train transports and so forth, were involved by the Nazis in the transportation and extermination process. This was a well-known fact in all Jewish communities of Europe, all in Palestine and in this country, a well-known fact, but never discussed in public. It is too horrible. Just as what I said to you earlier about governments that fought totalitarianism, adopting totalitarian techniques and becoming torturers in their own right, as we have seen it on our television screens, for God's sake, is not something that it is pleasant or even often feasible to discuss in public. This co-optation of the Jewish councils of Europe by the Nazis was, as it were, a Jewish secret. And to put this out in a book, as Hannah Arendt did, simply describing what was said at the trial, but all the other reports of the trial left this out because it was a kind of tacit, we don't talk about this. But she talked about it, using it as an illustration of the central kind of totalitarian technique, that you can recognize a regime as totalitarian when it implicates its victims in their own victimization. You can read about this in the daily newspaper today. The story of Iraq is currently now an implication of the people of Iraq in their own victimization. We're more familiar with it now. But at that time, you did not tell this kind of thing. So Hannah Arendt had the wrath of the organized international Jewish community fall on her head, orchestrated in this country by the American Jewish Committee. And for years, everywhere she went, there was nothing to be discussed except Eichmann in Jerusalem and how she had betrayed the Jewish people. Major figures like Gershom Scholem would come forth and say, "You are heartless, you have no love for the Jewish people," he writes, and she has to reply to this. It overshadowed, to understate it, Hannah Arendt's entire life in the 1960s. But she had the incredible, I thought it was incredible, courage in the last years of her life to revisit this topic and to rethink the whole of the controversy and what had occasioned it and what it meant. And she did this in the book that she was writing in the last years of her life that's called The Life of the Mind, a book that is almost unread because she didn't live to finish it. It was to have 3 parts to it: thinking, willing, judging. She wrote the thinking part, the willing part, and not a word of the judgment part, alas. In this little book that I've published, I tried to recreate from the notes that she left and from the lectures that I had the privilege to hear, what it was that she was trying to say about judgment. But the thinking part is provoked. It sets off by I made the claim that Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem was, as I saw him in Jerusalem, was a thoughtless man. I cannot argue this. I didn't argue it in the report on the banality of evil. I will argue it now, what I meant. You can't talk about what thoughtlessness is unless you can say what thinking is. So this first volume is What is Thinking? And it ranges over all of the theories in the history of Western philosophy about thinking and comes to rest. Or that's an exaggeration. It comes to quiver over the definition of thinking that is to be found in several of the Platonic dialogues in the mouth of Socrates, who defines, as it were, thinking as a conversation between me and myself. And Arendt argues that the moral question that a thinking person, that is a person who has a conversation going on in their heads, puts to themselves is not, what would God think of this? Or what will my reputation be? Or what did my mother say? Or any reference to a divinity, to a law established by human beings or natural law. None of this, she argues, is satisfactory foundation for a moral life. A moral life revolves around one question and one question only. Could I live with myself if I did this deed? Because she is assuming that each of us lives with somebody inside ourselves, the person with whom we have our conversations, with whom we discuss things. And that person will be represented by other people in the world because we have these conversations also with other people, and we internalize conversations that we've had with other people. We go seeking other people. What do you think? And she always felt that our questions to others, like, what do you think, are on the basis of having put that question to yourself. Well, what do I think? That thinking is not just a kind of a cogitation. It's a questioning and a self-questioning. And her own work in this last period of her life is such a questioning. What was I thinking when I called Eichmann thoughtless? What's the significance of calling him thoughtless? It means, in her term, that he was immoral, but immoral in this very specific way, that he never asked himself, could I live with myself if I did this? Could I live with myself if I put these many people on a train to go to a camp, to be taken off the train, and to be herded down and put in an oven and gassed? It was not anywhere on the man's horizon. It's the most individual moral notion, I think, in the whole history of Western philosophy. Because grounds its morals as religious traditions ground their morals in something outside, whether from above or from around, not in the interiority of one's own heart with such a question as that. It's an extraordinary book, this late book, and as I say, I think it's the least read of Hannah Arendt's books, and in many respects, the most important. But I'm hoped I've given you some sense here of the range of the things that she thought about. I have not dwelt here on why Arendt matters for us now, in the sense of I draw these connections for you, though I've been alluding to that, for the simple reason that I think that once these kinds of ideas are put in front of you, you're thinking people, and you're sitting there thinking, oh, yeah, well, I'm and you're doing that work. So I don't really need to do it with you. I always had the feeling while I was writing Why Arendt Matters that my whole task was a little superfluous, because if I could animate her ideas and her thinking process, then I didn't really have to tell anybody what to do with it. Just like, all right, here is a way of thinking. What would happen if you put it in your head, and let it go. Her work, like the work of all the great philosophers, is less about the specific content, the specific ideas, and most importantly about the process of thinking, the manner of thinking. All of the great philosophers have a way of thinking, which is, you can't understand anything that they actually have to say unless you can attach yourself to the way of thinking. This was the way that Hannah Arendt taught philosophy, and I had a great good fortune to learn it this way, that you had to think your way into the way that this person would pose a question. I always feel when I do psychoanalytic work that this is the central thing that I learned out of my philosophical training, because I know in my psychoanalytic work that if I can't anticipate where my patient's words are going to go, or recognize a dream as, oh, this could only be dreamt by so-and-so. This has to be so-and-so's dream if I saw a text, because I know the mental processes, the habits of thought, the ways of thinking of people. There's nothing better than psychoanalysis for learning this. But next best is a philosopher who can teach you that out of respect for the specificity of any given person's mind. But as with any great philosopher, so with Hannah Arendt, that there's a very specific way of thinking. But if you go down deep enough into it, you find its universal connection with the way all people think. And a great philosopher is always working at that depth, where the specificity of their own mind and their own experience, their own lived life meets up with something that can be recognized as universal. That's a paraphrase of a very beautiful definition of cosmopolitanism that her teacher, Karl Jaspers, penned, and that they both believed in very deeply. So enough of this. I was to talk with you for an hour, and then the way the program is organized is that there's a half an hour for you to put questions to me or to anybody else, whichever way you want to do Q&A. yeah. Is it all right if I just, where's my hostess? Yeah. Is it that I feel this? Yeah. If I do this, it's a hypothetical. If I do this, will I be able to? In Arendt's understanding, a truly evil person would never put the question. See, that's what's really, I think, important about her thought. It's not that they would say, oh, no problem. They would not even be able to grasp the question, because they're not activated internally for that kind of conversation. I think that you'll notice with people who are I personally don't believe that anybody is intrinsically evil, that born evil, or what my folks used to call a bad seed. I don't really subscribe to that, but people can certainly be organized from childhood forward for evil. And in my experience, the people who are capable of doing evil deeds are ones who get very driven on whatever project it is that they are doing, and they value that enormously. They invest everything in it. In political terms, they have an ideology to justify it, and on they go without making that reflexive internal turn. If they do it passionately enough, as it were, they become incapable of that. But most of the evil that is done in our world is done by people who are perfectly decent people, who in the passion of what they are doing, like I remember being just stunned when Madeleine Albright, our Secretary of State, was put the question about this was about the bombings of Yugoslavia. What if 10,000 people die? And she paused for a moment, not to have an internal conversation. She said, I think it's a price we have to pay. This kind of calculation in terms of, it's all right to expend 10,000, 100,000, whatever lives for what you are doing, it doesn't have a reflexive turn to it. It doesn't have a turn that goes, can I order that bombing? Can I live with myself if I drop that bomb on Hiroshima? Yeah. It's astonishing to me, I don't know how it is to you, but it's astonishing to me that in my whole lifetime, I mean, not that I was aware of this as a child, but that it has been impossible to question whether our bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was in any way justifiable. It has been impossible to raise the question. Of course it was justifiable. Didn't it bring the war to a quicker close? Didn't it save many, many hypothetically American lives? Didn't it? So what's your problem? Yeah. The decision itself had no reflective turn to it. It had no reflective turn that went, can I launch that attack that was known that it would absolutely decimate two cities, and that it would be the first use of such a weapon? And anybody who knows anything about the history of warfare knows that once a weapon is used and exists in the arsenal of weapons, you're stuck with it. It may not be used again, but you're stuck with it. And we've been stuck with it ever since. Is it evil? Was it evil to do that? Yeah. To do that kind of bombing, or to make a calculation that goes, well, it's a price we have to pay, 1,000 lives. What do you think are the thinking processes of people who make those kinds of calculations? Yeah. Yeah.
Just a comment. I think there has been a critique. I mean, the very pilot who let the bombs go.
Yeah.
Certainly has.
He had some afterthoughts about it. Yeah.
It's true that nationally
But
it's been silenced.
when the Enoa Gray exhibition was supposed to be put up at the Smithsonian Institution, it did not get put up because we were not going to have a discussion of this. Yeah.
And I just ran after. I heard from somebody who did a PhD at Chicago with Hannah Arendt that he chose a topic that she knew nothing about because he was terrified with her. And I just wondered that she was so perfectionistic and that she didn't let anybody go unless they had something that could be published.
That's one of the apocrypha, of which there are, there's a huge collection of apocrypha. I mean, she was very formidable, but also a very kind and generous chicken soup when you needed it kind of person. But she was very firm about things. I'm always very fond of telling the story of my first doctoral dissertation. I wrote two. But my first one was on Heraclitus, the pre-Socratic Greek philosopher. And I worked on this for a year in the British Museum, and I brought it back. She didn't like to see doctoral dissertations before they were finished and ready to, she was not a get in there and read it chapter by chapter type of person. So I brought it back, and she took me out to dinner at a really lovely restaurant, which unfortunately still doesn't exist anymore downtown, called the Grand Ticino, where she liked to have the Ticinese, not quite German food, as she would call it. And we had a lovely talk, and then she said, "Oh, now, we must talk about this dissertation." I said, "Yes, well, let's talk about it." And she said, "My dear, if this thesis that you argue here, if this was right, would be really revolutionary. But it's wrong. I started all over again. I didn't think that was it's like you choose your battles. And that was not a battle that I thought it was really good to fight. I thought that I would learn more, profit more, be more, complete my education in the way that I wanted to complete it, if we were on the same page. So.
Was she aware of Milgram's experiment? Because it seems to me, and did she comment on it? Because it seems to me that tied in neatly with what she had said about Eichmann.
Yeah.
About the banality of evil.
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
Person is capable of. I think Milgram's experiment would have preceded.
No, it was in the 1970s. Yeah, but she knew about it, but didn't write about it. This is an experiment by Stanley Milgram where the subjects were invited to torture, in effect, an actor who would writhe in pain as the subject raised the intensity of a shock that the subject was to receive. It was a kind of a mock-up, and everybody who engaged in the experiment went ahead and raised the pain threshold for people. Nobody stopped and said to themselves, what am I doing here? Or why are you asking me to do this? Or does this seem... No one, yeah. Which I think, does tell you, a great deal about what coercive conditions are like, because these were obviously not evil people, but they were enrolled and instructed. And yeah, now it's a very powerful series of experiments. Yeah.
I attended the dialogue, the Mary McCarthy, Hannah Arendt dialogue.
Yeah.
A few weeks ago. Subsequently, I was thinking of this question that I wished I had posed at the time, but here you are, so I have that opportunity. Would you stand up and... Well,
She was saying that she heard a reading that took place in the village about a couple months ago of the excerpts of the correspondence between Hannah Arendt and Mary McCarthy, which, if you're not familiar with it, is a wonderful, wonderful book. Yeah.
That evening started with a kind of apologia, because, of course, Arendt had been ostracized by that very organization.
Yeah.
She was shunned, all the things.
The Leo Baeck Institute, yeah.
Personal impact that had upon her. Certainly it was hurtful and heartbreaking, but clearly she was not intimidated intellectually. She continued to write, and this last work that you're speaking of. Could you talk a little bit more about how this impacted upon her?
Well, it's a good question, and it's a very complex one. Because it was, of course, very hurtful to her and painful to her, and extremely painful that she was systematically misunderstood. I mean, I think that's one of the worst things for a writer. You put something out in the world and then it's systematically misunderstood. But she took a great interest in these misunderstandings and discussed them in her replies. Then she made a number of them to critics, and discussed them with her friends, many of whom wrote, Mary McCarthy did, in the Partisan Review, a typically snappy Mary McCarthy piece in which all Hannah Arendt's critics were shot down one after the other for being stupid. But it was very, very painful to her in many ways, but it also had the not unexpected consequence that people that she respected discussed it with her on a very deep level. She talked about it with Karl Jaspers, who was at the end of his life then, and he was in the year that he died, writing a little book, which unfortunately he never finished, about the Eichmann trial and the significance of the controversy. So she had, from friends like this, some sense of the significance of this controversy. There is no controversy in the late 20th century that raises the questions of what is evil, what is the mental process behind, more profoundly than this work of hers and the controversy that surrounded it. If you wanted to write a book about understandings of morality and evil in the late 20th century, there would be no better place to begin than this book. So in a certain way, by suffering the controversy, she knew that she had made a different kind of intellectual contribution, not the books per se, but the discussion. And in her way of understanding things, it is the intensity, the quality, the freedom of discussion that marks the difference between a society that is a politically alive and vibrant one and a society that isn't. In other words, the very fact that the controversy could take place was heartening to her, even though she thought the level of it was often abysmal, as it often was. There was an orchestrated controversy, and really literally orchestrated. Instructions sent out to rabbis about what they should preach against this book, manufactured at Controversy Central in the American Jewish Committee. And it didn't prevail. You know, the controversy went on with all kinds of opinions represented. It proved impossible to propagandize over ethical questions. And for her, that was a very heartening thing. I once asked her when my former husband and I had the great pleasure of taking Hannah Arendt on a tour of London sites. She had made a list of things that she was visiting in London, and we were living there, things that she wanted to see. They were all political things. The Tower, and we were having lunch after doing this tour, and we were talking about the Eichmann controversy. And I said to her, as I too was curious as you were, this is such a hurtful controversy, and for you personally. And she said, in the great scheme of things, one person's feelings don't matter a bit.
And her smoking, her fingernails, I mean, the stress of this clearly was visible. She was very...
Absolutely. Hannah Arendt was a very anxious person, clinically diagnosable. Yeah. A very anxious person with lots and lots of anxiety symptoms. And one of her main anxiety symptoms, which was this chronic smoking, is one of the reasons that she died at the age of 69. It's very sad, but it's also, Mary McCarthy beseeched Hannah Arendt to stop smoking at the last one. She said, I will try, but if it interferes with my writing, I would rather write. And that was the perspective on it. Yeah. Did she ever condemn Heidegger? She didn't condemn Heidegger in the sense of, saying something, like this is ridiculous. But in the Origins of Totalitarianism, there's a long passage, a very angry passage about the European intellectuals, read non-Jewish, who were, what's the word in English? Suzanne, how do you translate like Skulltongue? Complicit, who were complicit with the Nazis, and a kind of a mocking sentence they offered their brilliant intellects to the Nazi regime, which was, of course, not interested. And so there's that, and then there are other places. There's a Partisan Review article called "A Survey of Modern European Philosophy," in which she has a paragraph that absolutely, talks about the Heidegger as the last romantic, capital R, the last romantic we hope, sarcastic and angry kind of thing. And then a piece on his 80th birthday where she has a long paragraph about his time. But she didn't condemn it. What she, I think, did was to keep talking with him about it. Karl Jaspers gave up talking with him about it soon after the war, thinking that he was incorrigible. As Jaspers says in his correspondence, mendacious. You don't want to talk to the man because he's a liar. I think she always, out of love, had that hope that she could change him. A lot of women have suffered over this particular approach to romance, and nothing in the brilliance of her intellect saved her from that particular, Yeah.
Two questions. You moved kind of quickly for me when you talked about her three things, and when you talked about a distinction between French and the American revolutions, and you went through it and said how it was political. Then you moved very quickly by saying how this not having its full play in our world, sort of the downfall of our modern world, and it went into globalization very quickly. Could you sort of expand on that, sort of fill in the blanks?
You'd like me to go from 1962, when that book was published, to the present moment without skipping all the steps as I did before. Yeah.
Fill in the blanks a little bit more so I can follow that. And then I don't know if this other question is kind of relevant. Could you sort of position her with respect to Nietzsche a little bit on the face?
Well, that's an even harder question. the stereotypical way that we think about people's political orientations, that they run from right to left, is our heritage from the French Revolution. And right means against, conservatively against movements for redistribution of wealth, for abolishment of class structure and so forth. Left means, and you can go left, means that you want to see the state, as Marx put it, wither away, because it won't be necessary to regulate anything, because once you've dealt with all the economic injustice, there will be no really need for regulation. There will be self-regulating. So that's the way we generally line things up in politics. And she absolutely rejected this understanding, found it relevant to the 18th century, a little bit relevant to the 19th century, and totally useless for the 20th century, because for her, it really came down to there are two types of political positions to take. Those that foster democratic participation and constitution writing, whether that be for your local town government or right on up to your national government or for your international governance. She never believed in world government, thought that would be formula for tyranny, but she was interested in governance. Politics which supports the participation of people to engage in actions which make actions possible. That is, to be always reflective. Your basic political question as an actor should be, this is different from your moral question. It should be, is this action which I'm going to take be an action which furthers the possibility for action in the world? Or is it going to be one that somehow closes that off? So there are two types of political thinkers and actors in her world, the ones that want action to be magnified and made possible by all actions, and then those who don't. And over there you can put authoritarians of the left, authoritarians of the right, authoritarians of the center, authoritarians of anywhere on the political spectrum that you want. So for her, this is also key connected to whether, if you are a promoter of the people's participation in their own political lives, then you foreground that, and the economic arrangements that those people who constitute a community make is secondary to the type of community that they make. In other words, they don't make a community for the purpose of economic affairs. They make a community, and then every community has to have economic affairs. And you try to organize your economic affairs so that they don't destroy your politics. So in the context of globalization, you would want the existence of international or transnational corporations, for example, to be approached by people who value politics as, do these transnational corporations further the possibility of politics in communities, in states, between states, in regional economies, or do they negate it? And that's the only question you have to ask. From her point of view, it's like utterly simple. But the important thing is that when you look at a phenomenon like the Cold War, for example, you do not look at it as the good guys are in America promoting capitalism and the bad guys are over here in the Soviet Union promoting communism. You look at it and you say, oh my God, two colossi promoting the destruction of politics in two different ways. Well, what are we going to do? Where's the alternative? Why? And then she would look to, she was very, very interested and excited in the Solidarity movement, for example, because this was a political process resulting in a type of revolution which is neither the French Revolution nor the American Revolution, but a new type, a non-violent constitution founding type of revolution, more like the American than like the French, but absolutely committed to nonviolence. This is like Gandhi's revolution, but more political. You know, I mean, the influence of the nonviolent, the theory of nonviolence upon this revolution was profound. She never anticipated that. Who would have? You know, it should have been the case that the streets of Gdansk were littered with corpses. But in fact, it wasn't, to everybody's great surprise. Not that the Polish Revolution or the Hungarian Revolution were completely nonviolent, but it was stunning. Anyway, so she was always looking, well, where's the alternative? Where are the people who are not thinking in terms of top-down control upon people that suppresses their political life, suppresses their political education, suppresses the young? One of the most beautiful, she had many definitions of political action, depending on which angle you're coming at and what the context of the discussion is. One of the definitions is political action is action that marks new beginnings. In other words, it's about novelty. It's about bringing something into the world that hasn't been in the world before. What kind of regime promotes that? Would be always her question. And what kind of regime demotes that? And that was how she measured, those were her criteria. We live in a situation, a very, very interesting one now, in which we have more forums for political action of new types than I think there have ever been in the history of the world. Do you know how many non-governmental organizations are represented at the United Nations? 4,000 from all over the world. There is more action going on out there in so-called NGOs, cross continents, in regions, and this involving, I'm reading a book now that's called The 50 Million, and it's about the 50 million people who work for NGOs, it's a sizable chunk of people who are all involved in political action of various sorts. This didn't exist when Hannah Arendt was alive in 1975, looking out on. And you have all kinds of other movements. A feminist movement, you have a very vibrant thank God now, environmentalist movement, which is what the momentum of this is building. There are more possibilities for action in the world now than there ever have been. And the forces that are organized to suppress action are more formidable than they have ever been. It's like we have a huge Cold War going on right now, which hasn't even really been described as such because everybody's so busy talking about the clash of civilizations, the stupidest, most, oh, well, I shouldn't get started on why anybody would believe Samuel Huntington's description of anything. But at any rate, we do not have a clash of civilizations going on. You know, we don't. What we do have is a huge clash between forces that are organized to suppress people's local and community and national action and forces that are interested in promoting it. And the fate of the earth depends upon the course of that huge clash. And in Islamic world, there are people who are interested in local politics. Many of them live in Tehran. And there are people who are interested in the suppression of politics. And in Washington, D.C., there are many people who are interested in vibrant political action and many people who are interested in suppressing it. These are not two civilizations facing each other, you know. They are very mixed bags of people, and the real contest is elsewhere, in my opinion.
In the beginning of your talk, you said that according to Arendt's interpretation, or what she had to say, according to what she said, that Iran and Iraq would not be considered totalitarian governments. And I'm wondering what features of those regimes exclude them.
That's a very good question, because this word totalitarianism is such a shibboleth that's sort of plunked down on everything. Condoleezza Rice, before the invasion of Iraq, went to France and started talking with the French about the totalitarian regime in Iraq, and they all said, "What? What? What are you talking about?" Yeah, but she could get away with it in this country because we're not very sophisticated here about the way we talk about politics. The French, you know, are these hyper-intellectual people who are sometimes too sophisticated for their own good, just, you know, couldn't believe this. So what are the features that were missing from Saddam Hussein's regime that would disqualify it from this? One is that this was not a regime that was organized around its secret service. It was organized around its Republican Guard. That is, the role of the army and Saddam Hussein's control over it was much more central. It's not that they didn't have a secret police. They did. But it wasn't, the balance was not tipped that way. It did not have a very functioning bureaucracy. And the efficiency of the bureaucracy is one of the main ingredients of a totalitarian regime. That's one of the things that made it so hard to assess Mao's China, because it had a very different course of development, and it was very hard in the 60s to judge whether this was really a totalitarian regime, because it didn't really have a bureaucracy of that sort. And it too, though it had a secret service, was much more dependent upon the cultural police, the Red Guard, which were a different kind of a police than had been seen before. And the other thing that Iraq did not have is that the structure of a totalitarian regime is not the pyramidal structure of an authoritarian regime, where you have a chief guy up here and then layers upon layers upon layers, and this guy controls this one, and on it goes right down. Arendt's description, absolutely brilliant, of the form of government of totalitarianism is like an onion, that there's a hollow center. The leader is not really the key to the whole thing. There are layers and layers and layers of organizations, each one facing inward on one organization and outward on another one, and controlling this one inwardly by means of the secret police and controlling this one outwardly by means of the army and various propaganda techniques. So that it's like that. And this makes the inner parts of the onion impervious to what's happening in the rest of the world and impermeable to the rest of the world. And Saddam Hussein's regime was not like that. He sent United Nations inspectors to this regime to look around for the so-called weapons of mass destruction. Do you think that Hans Blix would have been welcome in Berlin? Oh, no. You know, even it would create the occasional place where the Red Cross could visit, the occasional mock concentration camp. But there was no permeability of this and this was not the case and it's not the case in Tehran today, which is a standard authoritarian structure that is now undergoing a terrific dislocation because the mullahs, who are really the governing, they've got a guy in the presidency elected by the people that they don't like. They really against him. You know, he is not a good Muslim, this guy, and they want him out. How this is going to happen is really amazing. It's going to be amazing to watch. Absolutely the worst thing that we could do now is to make any kind of aggression against Iran while this internal power struggle, and internal power struggles are not really the name of the game in a totalitarian regime. You see what happened to the Rom faction, Hitler. There was a little dissenting army group, not secret service, but army group, erased them instantly. That's not happening in Iran. There's a lot of ferment. Do you know what the best-selling work of philosophy is in Tehran now? Hannah Arendt's The Origins of Totalitarianism. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.